Last lecture, we considered the possibility that personal identity is preserved over time by psychological continuity. We considered the possibility of a Hicks-style afterlife, where God preserves personal identity into the afterlife by creating a new body and imprinting our blueprint onto that body. But this theory has a number of problems. Unlike numerical identity, it is possible for more than one person to be psychologically continuous with you. We considered the story of a Star Trek transporter accident where Commander Riker's body was essentially divided in two and the missing parts replaced by extra matter so that there were two psychologically continuous copies of him. Since it's not possible for Riker to be two places at once, it seems clear that psychological continuity cannot preserve identity. But if Riker's entire body had been transported back up to the ship, if there had been no accident, then Riker would have survived, right? In other words, if all his matter converted into energy and all that energy moved to a new location and then was transferred back into matter into the same configuration, Riker would survive. The person on the other end of that process would be him. This is what we call matter transport, and it seems to preserve personal identity. Now, if we don't think matter transportation preserves personal identity, then we don't think the transporter is really a transporter. It's just a suicide copy machine. It just kills you in one place and creates a replica in a new place. But I don't think that jives with our intuitions. Because we would still have the same body, most people think that matter transport preserves identity. But if that intuition is right, perhaps it is the preservation of your body that preserves your personal identity. In short, we might say it is in virtue of the fact that you now and your 8-year-old self have the same body that you are the same person over time. If this is right, survival into the afterlife is possible only if some person in the afterlife can have the same body as you. Because the early Christians and Jews had this kind of view of persons, bodily resurrection played a prominent role in their understanding of the afterlife. For them, survival into the afterlife is not accomplished by the survival of one's soul floating away to heaven. One's identity is directly tied to one's body, and so survival into the afterlife is accomplished by the physical resurrection of one's body. And this, it's usually thought, is not accomplished until the end of days or the end of time. This is why Jesus' resurrection is so important to early Christian theology. For example, if you look at Paul's writings in 1 Corinthians 15, you will see that belief in the resurrection is an essential component of Christianity. His argument goes something like this. If Jesus was not resurrected, then there's no resurrection after death. And if there's no resurrection after death, then there's no afterlife. And if there's no afterlife, well, then what's the point? There's no afterlife. He says the Corinthians' faith is empty, Paul's preaching is in vain, and Christianity is pointless. As Paul himself says, if the dead are not raised, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. Nevertheless, the notion that an afterlife could be accomplished by resurrecting the dead faces some serious objections. First of all, if a person's body preserves their personal identity, if one is the same person over time in virtue of the fact that one has the same body over time, then whatever body is resurrected at the end of days would have to be the same body that one had when they died. The problem is the majority of dead people's bodies have long since decomposed and completely turned to dust. There is no body to resurrect. So it would seem that an afterlife is only possible for those who have died relatively recently, and certain Egyptian pharaohs who were lucky enough to be mummified. Now, but wait, you might think, what if God could resurrect your body, even though it had been decomposed, by tracking down all the atoms that make up your body when you died and then reconfiguring them in exactly the way they were when you died, excluding some injury, for example, that caused you to die or something like that? Well, There are a couple of problems with this notion. First, when your body decomposes, its atoms don't just lie around doing nothing. They re-enter the ecosystem. If someone plants an apple tree where your corpse was buried, its roots reach into the ground and find the nutrients that your body provides and uses the atoms of those nutrients to grow. If someone else comes along and eats one of those apples, the atoms that once made up your body are now making up part of that person's body. So let's suppose that someone eats only apples from that tree, so that eventually their body is made up of all the atoms your body had when you died. So basically they're just kind of made up of your corpse. And then they die. What happens then? Who gets those atoms when it comes time for the resurrection? If a resurrected person is you only if that person has the atoms your body had when you died, but someone else has all your atoms, then logically, God can resurrect only one of you. It is logically impossible to resurrect both. Now, this may seem outlandish, this idea of someone eating only apples from that tree, but in reality, it's true for everyone. There's only a limited amount of matter on planet Earth, and it's constantly going through the cycle of life and death. Strictly speaking, at least some of the atoms that are in your body right now were most likely atoms that belong to some past dead person's corpse. In general, we all share so many atoms that when it comes time for the resurrection, it will be impossible for everyone to be raised. Simply speaking, we're all made of the same material, the same shared material. It'd be like buying one Lego set and then trying to make all 5 of the things that can be made out of that Lego set all at once. I can't make both the police car and the police boat. They both need the windshield. But it gets worse. Even if God did somehow magically ensure that everyone had unique atoms upon their death, atoms that no one else ever had upon their death, so that he could put everyone back together, it's still not clear that a person resurrected by reconstruction really is the same person. Let me adapt a couple of thought experiments from the Christian philosopher Peter Van Inwagen to explain why. Suppose a little boy builds a house out of Legos. Legos work nice for these examples. He then goes out to play with his friends. When he goes, his sister notices the house and kicks over the Lego house just out of spite. Big sisters can be like that. Trust me, I know. Dad comes along, sees what happened. All the Legos spread out everywhere. And so he rebuilds the house Lego by Lego, just like his son had built it. Every piece in exactly the same place. He puts every piece exactly where it was. So the son then comes home, wanting to show his friends the house that he built. Is this possible? The same material that he configured is there, and it's in the same configuration. But it's not only a qualitative duplicate, but it's a physical duplicate as well. Yet, it doesn't seem that the house he built still exists. Essentially, to the identity of the house that he built, essential to the identity of the house that he built was the fact that he built it. That is essential. But the Lego house that now exists was built by his dad, not him. So even though it's made of the same material, configured in the same way, it's not numerically the same house. It seems, Van Inwagen suggests, just having the same body does not suffice for numerical identity. The causal process that preserves identity has to be unbroken. The origin of the configuration makes a difference. Consider another example. Suppose Augustine penned a manuscript with his own hand, and a monastery in the Middle Ages had that manuscript. But then the monastery burned to the ground and the manuscript was destroyed in the fire, sending the atoms that made up that manuscript into the atmosphere in the form of ash. But then a current church claims to have that manuscript in their possession. When you try to point out that this is impossible, they argue that nothing is impossible for God and claim that God gathered up the original atoms that made up the manuscript, including the ink, and put them all back together just as they were before the fire, so that the manuscript they have is identical in every physical way to the original. Now, let's set aside questions about the believability of their claim that God actually did this. After all, many known forgeries of church relics exist, sometimes accompanied by stories almost as unbelievable. But let's assume for the sake of argument that this actually did happen, that God gathered all the original atoms and put them together in exactly the same way. Does that mean that it is now the same manuscript? Is it numerically identical to the one that Augustine penned? Van den Wagen says it's not, and that not even God could make it numerically identical. An essential part of the numerical identity of the manuscript is the fact that Augustine penned it. He was the cause of the ink being placed exactly where it is on the manuscript. Even though the new manuscript is physically identical to the original, the ink was arranged by God, not Augustine. So it is not a manuscript that Augustine penned. Thus, it is not the same manuscript. Once it was burned, the manuscript was gone for good. The causal chain has been broken. So its numerical identity cannot be preserved, even if God reconfigures it atom by atom. The same goes for people's identities, Van den Wagen says. Even if God gathered all the atoms of a decomposed corpse back together and configured them just as they were in the moment before that person's death, person still would not survive. A necessary component of preserving a person's numerical identity is maintaining the same causal explanation for why that person is configured as they are. You are you, partly because you are responsible for the configuration of your atoms, specifically the configuration of your neurons. If instead God is responsible for that configuration, then it's not really you. So, how, according to Van den Wagen, could God facilitate our survival into the afterlife? It would seem impossible. Most people's bodies have long since decayed, and even reanimating a recently deceased corpse like Dr. Frankenstein would introduce causal influences that would make preserving numerical identity impossible. But, Van den Wagen says, God could still do it if he stole your nearly dead body away at the last second and then repaired it. That wouldn't cause a problem for personal identity any more than, say, a life-saving surgery. But how, you might rightly ask, could there be a corpse in your coffin if God stole your body away to repair it right before your death? By replacing it instantly with an inanimate replica, a fake dead body. And then that fake is what we bury. So, in the same way that John Hick's version of God facilitating survival into the afterlife replicates science fiction, like the Star Trek transporter, Peter Van den Wagen invokes another bit of sci-fi to make sense of his story of resurrection or afterlife, Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Of course, this theory is possible, but it's also unfalsifiable. There's no way we could differentiate between us actually dying and God inexplicably and imperceptibly stealing our living bodies to heal them and then replacing them with an inanimate copy. There is no way to test whether or not this actually occurs. This really just looks like an ad hoc excuse to save the theory that there is an afterlife from falsification. But the idea that personal identity is preserved by body identity faces another hiccup. To see why, consider a classic philosophical thought experiment, the ship of Theseus. The ancient Greek biographer Plutarch gives us one of the earliest versions of this puzzle. Here's how it goes. Theseus, the legendary founder of Athens, sailed home from Crete in a ship that the Athenians kept for hundreds of years afterwards. Over time, the sails and planks decayed, and so they had to be replaced one by one to preserve it. Eventually, every old plank had been replaced. Question: is the ship still Theseus's ship? Is it one and the same object? You can see how this thought experiment raises the question of numerical identity. What you may not realize, however, is that the story is analogous to what happens to our own bodies. As we live, the cells that make up our body are replaced with matter that we ingest as food and drink. Although it's a bit simplistic, over roughly a 7-year time span, all the matter that originally made us up is gone and replaced by new matter. Everything that made up your 8-year-old self is completely gone from your body now. So if we are going to account for personal survival with bodily survival, we must account for the fact that all the cells in our body are gradually replaced. Now, that's easy enough. Instead of thinking in terms of bodily identity, as if you and your 8-year-old self have exactly the same body made of exactly the same matter, we can think of terms of bodily continuity. Just as there's a great overlap in our psychology from moment to moment, there's a large overlap in your body's configuration from moment to moment. Most of the atoms that you have in your body at this particular moment are the same atoms that you had in the moment before, and those are similar to the ones in the moment before, et cetera, et cetera. So we might say that bodily continuity preserves personal identity. What's more, we don't really need to worry about the continuity of your entire body. It's really just your brain that matters. Consider, for example, if we ever perfect full body transplants. Say you're in an accident that leaves your entire body useless, but someone else had an accident that injured only their brain, leaving the rest of their body intact. If we were to perform a full body transplant, we wouldn't think that the other person had half survived. The other person died because their brain was annihilated. You survived because your brain survived. It's now just attached to an entirely different body. Now, it would be really nice if the cells that make up your brain, your neurons, were never replaced over time. If the neurons we're born with were the same neurons we died with, it'd be easy to account for personal identity over time. We wouldn't even have to rely on physical continuity. We could just say that we're the same person over time because we have the same brain over time. But this is not the case. Contrary to common belief, just like every other cell in your body, neurons die and are replaced. Your brain is doing it all the time. There's even ways that you can encourage the growth of new brain cells. I'll leave that up to you to research. So, even if we think the physical survival of the brain is what preserves personal identity, we have to admit that we are appealing to physical continuity of the brain. But physical continuity, although likely necessary for personal survival over time, is sadly still not sufficient. Why? Well, consider the fact that, body snatching aside, the brain in a corpse that is in a coffin is physically continuous with the brain of the person who died, made of the same material. Yet, we wouldn't say that the person is in the coffin. Person died, they no longer exist. The brain in the body in the coffin is made of the same material as the brain of the person who died, but the person no longer exists, so mere physical continuity of the brain is not enough to preserve identity. But, of course, this is because the brain and the corpse is not functioning, right? It is no longer capable of producing mentality. So we might say that the physical continuity of a functioning brain is necessary for the survival of personal identity. Now, this gets us closer, I think, but our insatiable quest for immortality leads us to another counterexample that points out a problem with even this criterion. Cryonics. Cryonics is the process of freezing one's body just prior to death in hopes of preserving that body until medical science has advanced enough to heal or cure whatever was going to cause death. Baseball legend Ted Williams and his son John Henry are perhaps the most famous example of people who have done cryonics. I also found an example of a college girl named Kim Swosey, who had her head frozen at 23 in hopes of it being unfrozen and cured of its brain cancer and attached to a donor or a robot body once technology advanced enough. During the time that the body or head is frozen, it doesn't have a functioning brain, one that is capable of producing mentality. However, although this has not yet happened, and perhaps it can't happen because freezing bodies damages them in an irreparable way, but if one day one of these bodies were successfully thawed and cured, we would likely say that person survived despite the fact that there was a large amount of time during which their brain did not function properly because it was frozen. So it can't merely be the continuity of a functioning brain that is necessary for the survival of a person. Something else is necessary. The philosopher Peter Unger has proposed a way out of this problem. He realized that, although a cryopreserved brain is not currently producing mentality, it still has what he calls mental capacities. That is, it could still produce mentality if it were thawed, if its corresponding body parts were appropriately healed, and if the brain and body were both fed the appropriate nutrients. With this in mind, we could say that personal identity is preserved by the physical continuity of a brain that has mental capacities. So if upon death your brain is reduced to goo, then there is no possibility of your survival even through cryonics, right? No mental capacities left. But if your brain is undamaged, frozen, and then later properly thawed, you could survive. This seems to be the strongest version of the bodily theory of personal identity. But like all other theories so far, it faces a couple of pretty serious objections. Here's one. The physical continuity criterion doesn't seem to track well with our intuitions in some circumstances. Consider another far-fetched but logically possible thought experiment. Suppose someone captures you and, intent on torturing you, ties you down in steel restraints. Let's suppose that the torture is so bad that you would rather die than suffer through it. I know it's morbid, but it's just a thought experiment. All right. Suppose I, however, the nerdy superhero, swoop in and show up to save the day. Now, I'm a nerdy superhero. I'm not strong enough to undo your restraints, but I do have a machine that can record your neural configuration and then write my neural configuration onto your brain and write yours onto mine. After the process, I, this body, will have your psychology, your memories, and your personality. Conversely, you, or that body, will have mine. In this way, I say, I'm going to take the torture for you, and you can get away in my body. Would you be relieved? If you're like most, you would, since your psychology is transposed to a different body that will not feel the torture. You think that you will not feel the torture. But notice that the body and brain that is physically continuous with yours is still going to be tortured. It's still there in the restraints. And so it seems that our intuition tells us that physical continuity is not necessary for personal survival after all. It seems that we are back to thinking that psychological continuity is necessary for personal survival or numerical identity. But the weird thing is, if we just tweak the experiment a little bit, we seem to get the opposite result in some conflicting intuitions. Suppose I don't want to alter my psychology in my brain, so I just offer to erase yours altogether and then just write a new, unique psychology onto your brain, new memories, new personality. Now, if this would accomplish your non-existence, you might be thankful because remember, you'd rather die than undergo the torture. But would you really think that I was saving the day? Would I be preventing you from feeling the torture? Or would you think that you would still feel the torture, you just have a new, unique personality while you did so? Again, if you're like most, you think the latter suggestion is true. It would still be you because it's still your body. But now our intuitions are back to telling us that it's bodily continuity that matters. It'll still be my body, so I'll still feel the pain. What's going on here? How do we make sense of the fact that our intuitions are so conflicting regarding what counts when it comes to personal survival? Well, there are a couple of options for making sense of this. One is to suggest that our intuitions conflict because continuity of both the mental and the physical, to some degree, is required for personal survival. our recognition that both are required pulls our intuitions in different ways in different circumstances. But upon reflection, this doesn't seem right, and we don't seem to even need crazy thought experiments to see why. Real-life cases of split brain patients provide all the counterexamples we need. But what is a split brain patient? Well, the two hemispheres of our brain are joined by the corpus callosum, but they can be separated when it is damaged by a seizure or cut by a surgeon, usually to prevent seizures. This is a split brain patient, and they usually suffer what is called alien hand syndrome. One side of their body can and will act independently of the other. One of my favorite examples is a woman who had difficulty picking out what to wear to work in the morning because her right hand would pick out a business suit, but her left hand would pick out something like a tube top and a miniskirt. And she could not will her left hand to put it back. She literally had to put it back and like pry her fingers off of it. I highly encourage you to look up other cases of split brain phenomena. They are fascinating. Michael Gazzaniga, a pioneer in split brain research, has a great book called Tales from Both Sides of the Brain. Experiments suggest that each brain hemisphere has its own stream of consciousness. You can say things that only one hemisphere hears, show things that only one hemisphere sees, and even elicit separate responses from split brain patients to the same question from each hemisphere. In another famous example, one patient's right hemisphere indicated that he wanted to be a draftsman when he grew up, but his left hemisphere indicated that he wanted to be a race car driver. The difficulty comes when you realize that the two numerically distinct persons who exist in split brain patients are both physically and psychologically continuous with one and the same person, the past person who existed before their brain was split. And as we saw with Commander Riker, it can't be the case that two separate persons are identical to the same past person. It can't be that one and the same person both did and did not hear the same thing. A second problem arises when you realize that continuity, whether mental or physical, exists in degrees. Yet numerical identity does not exist in degrees. Some future person is either you or it's not you. If God creates a physically distinct but psychologically identical person in the afterlife, either that's you or it isn't. There is no in between. But physical and psychological continuity does come in degrees. For example, the body of someone who has a heart transplant is not as physically continuous as yours is, assuming that you have not had a heart transplant. A significant portion of their body was taken away all at once and replaced with new material. And of course, if you have a whole body transplant, most of your body would be made of new material. So the body of a transplant patient is not as physically continuous as one of a person who has not had a transplant. Of course, we can imagine this happening with people's brains as well. We may one day develop the technology to replace parts of people's brains as they malfunction. And some people may even need to have more replacement than others. And so, while someone who has had no transplants has a 100% physically continuous brain, someone else may have an 80% continuous brain, or 50%, or 25%. There are different degrees of physical continuity. In the same way, we can talk about degrees of psychological continuity. As the result of an accident or disease or surgery, changes in the brain might cause someone's personality or memories or other parts of their psychology to change. You may even have seen this happen to people that you know. And such changes can happen in an instant. So someone might be 80% or 50% or 25% psychologically continuous with their former self. We could even imagine a graph that represents all the different possible ways and degrees to which someone's brain might be physically and psychologically continuous. Problem is, where do you draw the "this is what makes a new person" line on such a graph? How much physical or mental continuity is required for the preservation of personal identity? Would you draw across the middle vertically or horizontally, or you could do it diagonally. Would it be curved? The problem is any line we draw will seem silly because it will mean minuscule differences between life and death. So let's say that we draw the line vertically at 50%, so that if 50% of your brain is preserved, you are still the same person, but if 49.99% of your brain is preserved, then you are not. Am I supposed to believe that if an accident preserves exactly 50% of your brain that you survive, but if that just one more neuron had been damaged, that you would cease to exist? Such a difference would be not even noticeable. One neuron could never mean the difference between life and death, and yet on this criterion, it would. Or perhaps we can think of it this way. Something that admits of degrees is vague, like color. There are things that are clearly red, like stop signs, things that are clearly not, like a daffodil, and things whose redness is debatable, like, say, some version of plum sauce or something like that. They are on the borderline. There is no fact of the matter about whether the plum sauce is red. It's just a matter of interpretation. Well, the same is true for physical and mental continuity. It's vague. There are clear cases of continuity, cases where it's clearly lacking, and borderline cases where there is no fact of the matter and it's just a matter of interpretation. But personal identity is not a matter of interpretation. Either you are or you are not the same person. If God creates a new body and copies your brain pattern onto it, then either you still exist and are experiencing things, or you are not and experiencing nothing. There is no vagueness. So, since physical mental continuity is a vague concept, but identity is not, it seems that it can't be the case that mental and physical continuity is what accounts for personal survival over time. But there is still the matter of our conflicting intuitions. Why do we sometimes think psychological continuity matters for survival and other times think that bodily continuity does? Robert Nozick suggests this conflict may reveal what actually is necessary for survival. His view is called the closest continuer view, and we'll explore it in the next lecture. But as we do, we'll see another question emerge, one that gives rise to even more and more reasons to doubt the concept of person even makes sense. Do persons really exist at all? So are you really you? As we've seen, sometimes people have conflicting intuitions about what matters for personal survival. Sometimes it seems to be physical continuity. Other times it seems to be psychological continuity. But Robert Nozick says that this is because what really counts is being the closest continuer. Now, what does he mean? Well, think back to the nerdy superhero example where you are bound in shackles and about to be tortured, and to help you, I only have a brain-erasing writing machine. If all I do is erase your psychology and write another one on your brain, you probably don't think this amounts to a rescue. Nozick suggests that this is because the person in your body is still the person in the story most similar to your previous self. They may not be psychologically continuous, but they are 100% physically continuous. They have the same body. No one else in the story is similar to you in any way. If, however, I write your psychology onto my brain and my psychology onto yours, that seems to change things. Yes, the person in the shackles is physically continuous with you, but now the person in my body is 100% psychologically continuous with you, and the person in your body is 100% psychologically continuous with me. And psychological continuity seems to be more important, at least in this circumstance. So the person in my body is now most similar to your previous self. So that's where it seems that you are. In light of such intuitions, Robert Nozick proposes his closest continuer theory, in which neither physical nor psychological continuity is absolutely required. Instead, the future person who is most closely psychologically and/or physically continuous with you is numerically identical to you. Identity is preserved by there being a closest continuer. Now, you might think that the Riker splitting case, where there is a tie because you have two people that are 100% psychologically continuous and only 50% physically continuous with the original person, is a counterexample to Nozick's closest continuer theory, because it's a case where there is no closest continuer. But Nozick would argue that his theory actually describes this situation perfectly. Since there is no closest continuer, there is no survival. Riker died in the transporter malfunction, and two new people with his psychology began to exist. So Nozick's view aligns perfectly with the logical fact that Riker can't be two places at once. Some philosophers are not convinced because Nozick's principle seems to violate something called the only X and Y principle. It suggests that whether two things, call them X and Y, are identical, whether that can be determined only by the properties that X and Y possess. The existence of some other thing, Z, cannot be relevant. For example, on Nozick's view, if the duplicate Riker had not been created on the planet, so there was no such duplicate at all, then Riker would not have died. The person on the ship would have been the closest continuer. But if there is a duplicate Riker, well, then Riker dies. But how can that be? Nothing about the person on the ship changed at all. How can that person be Riker in one scenario, but not in the other, when there is nothing different about that person in either scenario? How could whether there is a duplicate be relevant to whether or not the person on the ship is Riker? Well, Nozick argues that the existence of other objects can be relevant when dealing with identity. Consider the Vienna Circle, a collection of philosophers who met in Austria beginning in 1922. Let's say there were originally 20 members, but then when World War II breaks out, they flee Austria. Let's say 5 of them make it to London and continue meeting. Is that the Vienna Circle? It would seem so. But if 10 had made their way to New York City and were meeting there, that would seem to be the Vienna Circle. The existence of that group would be relevant to whether the London group is the Vienna Circle. In the Riker case, the existence of the duplicate is very relevant to whether or not the person on the ship is Riker. If there is no duplicate, then Riker can't be two places at once. But if there is, then he can be. Because if the person on the ship is Riker, and so is the person on the planet, and so Riker is both not and not on the ship. That's logically impossible, so the existence of the duplicate means that neither person is Riker. But even if we buy that argument, the closest continuer view, there is one counterexample that even Nozick himself admits his closest continuer theory can't quite handle. To understand it, we need to look at ways that an afterlife might be possible outside of religion with the use of future technologies. So, suppose I'm diagnosed with a terminal illness, and I'm not expected to live longer than a year. Suppose, however, that I also live in a future where human cloning is possible and where brain scanning and writing technology exists. So, to ensure my survival, I might do the following. 1, I'll have myself cloned. 2, I will have my neural configuration scanned. And 3, I'll arrange for my neural configuration to be written on my clone's brain after my death. Now, clearly, this clone copy will not be physically continuous with me. It will have a body made of new material. But once it is awoken, it will be 100% psychologically continuous with me. Therefore, if the closest continuer theory is right, this is a way I could survive past my biological death. the clone copy will actually be me because it would be my closest continuer. Now, clearly, I wouldn't want to do this immediately, like a full year before my predicted death. If I copy my neural configuration onto my clone before I die, then the clone copy wouldn't be me because it would not be the closest continuer. The person who was both psychologically and physically continuous with me, who was still in my original body, that would be the closest continuer. In other words, if I create a clone copy of myself before I die, I'll still be me. The clone copy will not. Why? Because me, the original person dying in my original body, is the closest continuer. My clone copy may be qualitatively the same, but it wouldn't be numerically identical. Otherwise, I'd be in two places at once, right? Now, you might think once I die, the clone copy would become me. If I did it before my death, and then once I die, it will become me, because then it would be my closest continuer. But that can't be right because the clone copy was not me while I was still alive. He was another person. If he did become me upon my death, well, then what happened to that other person? Did he just pop out of existence because I died? Clearly not. So, if I create a clone copy of myself a year before my death, the person in control of the clone copy would not be me, either before my death or after my death. In fact, if there's any overlap at all, any time at all in which both I and my clone copy are alive at the same time, whether it be a year, a month, a day, or even a second or a nanosecond, then creating a clone copy would not help me survive past my death. If there is a single moment in which the clone copy is not the one and only closest continuer, then it's not me in that moment, nor could it ever be. And herein lies the objection to Nozick's view. Let's suppose that I want to make sure that there is no overlap, but I also realize that I can't just trust the company I'm paying to do this to make sure it happens after I die. After all, once I'm dead, they could just take the money and run, and I couldn't do anything about it. So let's say I have them create a clone and record my neural configuration now. But then I lock the body of the clone, still sleeping, in a secret chamber and hook it up to the brain writing machine and then set the writing machine on a timer. I'm expected to live a year, so let's say I schedule to activate in 2 years, a full year after my expected death, just to make sure there's no overlap. In this way, I would think that I had guaranteed my survival, at least if the closest continuer view is right. After the writing is complete, the clone copy will be awakened, it will be my closest continuer, and I will be on my way. Okay, but suppose I do all this, and then I live longer than a year. I'm still sick, but after a year and a month, I'm still kicking. And then also after 6 months, and then after 8 months, and then after 11 months. Even if I'm on the verge of death, as the last moments of the second year tick down, and I know the timer is about to go off and create and awaken my clone copy, you are likely to hear me utter something quite very strange. Quick, kill me, otherwise I won't survive! This seems quite odd. A nanosecond of overlap could mean the difference between survival and non-survival? You must kill me so that I may live? That seems ridiculous. And even Nozick agrees. And so it seems that there is something wrong with Nozick's view. At best, it's incomplete. So, we have yet to articulate a theory of personal survival that is not subject to serious objection. It's a bit frustrating at this point, isn't it? But perhaps we're failing because we've been going about things all wrong. We've been conceiving of persons in the wrong way. As a result, we might have been asking the wrong question. In fact, maybe the question we've been asking doesn't even make sense. To see why, consider one of my favorite television shows, Doctor Who. Doctor Who is a British science fiction program about a character named the Doctor, who travels through time and space in his TARDIS, which looks like a London police box from the 1960s. The Doctor is a Time Lord, an alien who can regenerate, and consequently, he's been played by many different actors over the years, 13 as of 2015. The show celebrated its 50th year in 2013 with an episode called The Day of the Doctor. The anniversary special included Matt Smith, David Tennant, and John Hurt, the latter of whom played a previously unknown version of the Doctor. In contrast, the first episode of Doctor Who, An Unearthly Child, aired in 1963. It was in black and white and was only about 25 minutes long. At the time, instead of being a brash young man, the Doctor was a crotchety old geezer who was always giving those young whippersnappers what for. But this raises an interesting question. Are An Unearthly Child and The Day of the Doctor the same television show? Upon reflection, however, this is obviously a bad question. What do you mean by the same television show? They are, by most accounts, episodes of the same television show, despite the fact that they're separated by 50 years, but neither one of them is a single television show or series. Television shows don't air in one evening or in one day. They stretch out over weeks or years. Television shows are essentially collections or sets of individual episodes, and so it makes no sense to ask whether or not one individual episode is the same show as another episode. The only question that really makes sense is whether or not these two episodes are both members of the same set. Do they belong to the same series? Now, we could get into a debate about whether or not the 2005 reboot of Doctor Who really is the same show. I think it's pretty clear that it is, but that's not my concern here. Instead, I want to consider the possibility of whether we should be thinking of persons in the way that we think about television shows. We have been wondering, in virtue of what is it the case that you now and your 8-year-old self are the same person? But that question assumes that persons exist at a particular time, at a particular location, like an individual episode of a television show. But what if instead a person is more like an entire television show, something that exists stretched across time? What if a person is actually a series of what we might call person episodes, individual instances of bodies that exist at particular locations at particular times? Try another example. Suppose you're standing in the middle of an unused interstate. Are you standing where that road is? Well, no, because the interstate doesn't exist at any one particular location. It stretches across the surface of the earth over multiple states. In the same way, persons may not actually exist in any particular location and time, but instead exist stretched across time. The philosopher David Lewis suggests that persons are just such objects. I usually call it the space-time worm theory of personhood, but it's also called predurantism. Essentially, the idea is that a person is not a three-dimensional object that exists at a particular location, at a particular time, but a four-dimensional object stretched across time and space that consists of three-dimensional objects. Now, not just any collection of three-dimensional objects will do. I can't take a moment from your childhood, the moment of my present existence, and a future moment of the president's life, and put that all together and call that set a person. In order for a set of time slices to be part of a single person, they would have to share certain relations, like psychological and physical continuity. What's more, you can't just think of yourself from birth to, say, 8 years old and then call that little segment a person. It has to be the whole collection, birth to death. What's nice about this theory is that it can handle almost all of the counterexamples we've considered so far. Are Commander Riker and Lieutenant Riker the same person? No, because persons don't exist at a particular place and time. But we can consistently and coherently describe two different objects that share temporal parts but are discrete. We can even handle other crazy Star Trek examples, like in the original series episode The Enemy Within, when Captain Kirk, after beaming up to the Enterprise, splits into good Kirk and evil Kirk, and then is later reunited. we can identify two separate collections and simply say that they have most members in common. The time on Star Trek Voyager, when the Vulcan Chief of Security, Lieutenant Commander Tuvok, and the Talaxian cook Neelix are fused, how else, through another transporter accident, which seemingly creates a new person. We can accurately describe this new person, Tuvix, which was also the name of the episode, as the overlap between two space-time worms. This is a very fun and interesting theory. And if anything can make sense of personhood, it seems that it would be pedurantism. But of course, it's not without its problems. For example, it seems to entail that you don't exist until you die. It's got to be the complete worm. I know that sounds a bit odd, but if a person is a maximally large set of continuous person slices, and a person does not exist until that set is maximally large, then persons don't fully exist until they die. The set is complete. Unless, of course, you subscribe to omnitemporalism, the temporal ontology we discussed a few lectures back, which suggests that all moments in time exist even before they occur, and thus think that your future time slices already exist before they recur. But recall that omnitemporalism caused a few problems for believing that we have free will. Stranger still is the fact that if there is an afterlife and it will last forever, then persons will never exist. For example, if God creates a Hickean copy of you in an afterlife, we would include the time slices of that copy in your space-time worm. After all, they are psychologically continuous with your earthly slices. But if a person is a maximal set of time slices, well, since heaven is eternal, that worm is just going to keep growing forever. So it will never be maximal, and so you will never exist. Furthermore, the space-time worm theory seems to entail some vagueness that personal identity cannot tolerate. For example, my paternal grandfather, Earl, had Alzheimer's. It was pretty bad by the end. So, although his physical continuity remained constant, his psychological continuity did not. And by the end, his psychological continuity was pretty much all the way broken. Now, according to this theory, a person is a comprehensive collection of continuous time slices. But when defining what a person is, the set must be as comprehensive and continuous as possible. But there are two ways to describe the person that was my grandfather. The first is less comprehensive, but more continuous, where he ceases to exist earlier. We'd say that he really died when the dementia set in. Or we could say that he didn't die until his physical body died. That would be more comprehensive, but the set would be less continuous because it would include the last years of his life when his mentality was all but gone. The problem is the space-time worm theory gives us no criteria for delineating between such cases, telling us which collection really was my grandfather and thus seems to be unsatisfactory. So this is frustrating. Why can't we just find a theory that works? Well, some philosophers suggest that the reason all of these theories fail is because they are trying to make sense of the nonsensical. They're trying to account for the existence of something that doesn't actually exist. To understand what they might be getting at, consider a classical philosophical problem, the Sorites paradox, or the pile-heap problem. Suppose that you have what clearly is a heap of sand. Then you start taking away one grain at a time. Eventually, you will no longer have a heap. You'll just have a pile. But at what point did the heap stop being a heap and become just a pile? How many grains constitute a heap? When considering such questions, it quickly becomes obvious that any answer you give will merely be a matter of convention or opinion. If we said that 1 million grains of sand are needed to constitute a heap, we're giving a lot of power to one grain of sand, the millionth grain of sand. One less, and now it's a pile? This seems ridiculous. What's more, there really is no way to delineate between better definitions, Does it take 1 million or 2 million grains of sand to make a heap? Again, it's all just a matter of convention or opinion. What we could come to realize is that metaphysically or ontologically speaking, there is no genuine difference between the pile and the heap. All that exists is a collection of sand that can be described in different ways. It certainly isn't the case that upon the subtraction of a certain number of grains, a new thing comes into existence that wasn't there before, a pile. Heaps and piles don't really exist as something above and beyond the collection of sand. Heap is just a concept that our brains use to make better sense of the world. So really, the question of when the pile becomes a heap is what philosophers call an empty question. It's a question regarding something that you could know everything there is to know about, like exactly how many grains of sand are present and at what time, and still not know the answer to the question. Think back to the ship of Theseus example. Does replacing all the boards make it a new ship? It's just a matter of convention. It's certainly not the case that there is some extra thing, Theseus's ship, that exists in addition to the planks of wood. Your answer to the question just depends on how you decide to describe the situation. You can know everything there is to know about the boards and where they were and when they were, but you would still not know the definite answer to the ship of Theseus question, because there is no definite answer. But this is perhaps why we've had so much trouble finding an answer to the personhood question. The question of personal identity may be empty. Personhood might just be a construct or conception, one that has been invented by brains to help them make sense of the world. They divide the world into persons and non-persons to help categorize it, and even think of themselves as persons to make sense of what's doing the categorization. But just like there is no separately existing thing called a heap that exists in addition to the collection of sand, or a ship that exists in addition to the collection of planks of wood, so too there is no extra separately existing thing called a person that exists in addition to a body or even a four-dimensional space-time worm. It's all just how the brain conceives of the world and itself. We might even say that the question of personal identity over time is merely a linguistic problem, just a question about definitions. Think back to the William James squirrel example. We might say, for example, that the universe can be conceptually divided and organized in different ways, but that is all. Selecting some bit of matter and calling it a new object does not mean that some new thing has come into existence. Recall the Lego example. When my son and I build a Death Star out of Legos, are we adding to the substance of the universe, creating a new object? No, we're just rearranging existing matter in a new way that my brain can now conceive of in a new way as containing a new object, but there's no extra thing that's actually there. Well, the same could be true of persons. It's not that there isn't a body or collection of matter listening to this lecture. It's just that you, the person, don't exist as a discrete object above and beyond that collection of matter. One piece of matter, the brain in your head, may conceive of another piece of matter, your entire body, as a person, but it's all just convention. Now, it may seem strange to take seriously the suggestion that persons don't exist, but it may seem strange simply because we're programmed to see the world in that way. I'm once again reminded of Kant's noumenal phenomenal distinction. Philosophical reflection, we might say, reveals that the noumenal world, the world as it is, contains no persons. We can't help see it any other way, however, because we interpret the world through category-colored glasses. And person is one of those categories. The phenomenal world, the world of our perceptions, contains persons, but of course the phenomenal world is not reality as it really is. Besides, we've already seen good reason for thinking that persons don't exist. Think back to the split brain patients that we talked about in the last lecture. To borrow an argument from Thomas Nagel, if persons exist, then how many persons exist in a split brain patient? Is there one for each hemisphere, one on the right and one on the left? But what if we reunited the hemispheres? How many people are there then? And then what if they're separated again? Would a second person be continually going in and out of existence? And if the right hemisphere is doing enough to produce its own consciousness when it's not attached to the left hemisphere, why wouldn't it be doing enough to produce a person when it is attached to the left hemisphere? If there are two people in split brain patients, why wouldn't there be two people in all of us? But if the concept of a person applies to anything, it applies to non-split brain patients, right? The more you think about it, the more it seems that person is just a matter of convention. What's more, the suggestion that persons don't exist, it's nothing new. David Hume, for example, suggested that we are all just bundles of perceptions, collections of experiences, and that there is no extra thing called the person that exists above and beyond those bundles. All arguments over personhood or personal identity are really just disputes about how to use words, how to describe the bundles. And roughly a couple of thousand years earlier, the Buddha told us essentially the same thing, that the terms self and I don't really refer to anything. They're just grammatical conventions or devices. Philosophers who defend the no self or no person notion today, like James Giles, are quick to point out that the words I, you, and self and person are not meaningless or useless. It's just that there are two different kinds of meaningful speech. There's conventional speech and ultimate speech. The proposition, there are persons, is conventionally true because it serves as a useful convention. It helps us make sense of the world. But it's not ultimately true. As Giles says, quote, "It is a generally understood term whose proper use is determined by mutual agreement. And although personal names and personal pronouns do not at the ultimate level refer to anything, at the conventional level it is quite acceptable to use such expressions for pragmatic reasons. We just must not be led astray by using such words into thinking that they really refer to anything that's ultimately real." Now, of course,